Thank you so much for your patience and for welcoming me here to talk about the 16% of Gilded Age New Yorkers who worked in the service, or what we would call as servants. These are people who were parlor maids, chambermaids, scullery maids. There were butlers, under butlers, gardeners, there were grooms, there were drivers, there were footmen. If you had children, you would have a nursemaid, you would have governesses. There were endless numbers of positions of servants that servants could fill. And in the Gilded Age, an enormous number of households will employ them. Gilded Age, of course, is the period just after the Civil War to about 1910. So there's some things that happened in the Gilded Age that made it so that servants were much more in demand. The first thing, of course, was the rampant immigration in that era. The first great wave of immigration came in the 1830s and 1840s, and these were mostly Irish, German immigrants. There was a pause during the Civil War years, and then after the Civil War, immigration started up again, even greater numbers. Besides Irish girls and men and Germans, there were Jewish immigrants, others from Eastern Europe, Southern Italy, Northern Italy, Spain, Scandinavia, France. Europeans poured into New York City, and one of the jobs that many unskilled laborers from Europe could get would be as a servant. The other thing that gave rise to a greater need for servants is the fact that there was a lot of money making going on during the Gilded Age, hence the term Gilded Age, which is when the city sort of glittered and there was lots of wealth being built, but sort of at the core was kind of corruption. That's where the term comes from. So corruption is one way that people made these great fortunes, but there are also ways on the up and up. There was stock market was very big. The merchant class rose. There were middle class people to very wealthy people, and they all wanted to have servants in their house. If you had a brownstone and you were more of an upper middle class type family, you might have 3 or 4 living servants. If you were one of the super wealthy families, sort of the new millionaires, which is a word that was coined in the Gilded Age, you could have 10, 15, even 20 servants living in your own home, catering to every one of your desires. I wanted to showcase a couple of these wealthy mansions. You could click the slide. Oh, here's our servants. This is for a family called the Chartreuse. These are Fifth Avenue servants. You can see their dress is very formal and stiff. None of them are smiling. But there were some benefits to being servants, which we'll talk about soon. Okay, so this is the Rice Mansion. This is on Riverside Drive, and it's actually still in existence today. This was built by a very wealthy family, Isaac and Julia Rice. They lived there with their 6 children. In this mansion, the servants would have all lived on the top floor. You can see those sort of dormer windows peeking out. And because they had so many children, they probably had lots of nursemaids and governesses living up there, as well as maids. There are lots of different levels of maids and a butler, perhaps. Excuse me, what mansion? The Rice family? This is on Rice, R-I-S-E, on the board. R-I-C-E. And where is? This is on Riverside Drive in 89th Street, and it still exists today. It's actually a Jewish school. Not a family home anymore, but still very lovely. Next one. This is another mansion on Riverside Drive. This is was between 73rd and 74th Street. This is the Schwab Mansion. Henry Schwab made his money in steel. He was very rich. He lived here with his wife. They didn't have children, and they had 20 servants who probably occupied a servant's wing. I don't think that they would give the servants those beautiful top dormer windows. But 2 people and 20 servants catering to their every need. This is the Carnegie Mansion, Cooper Hewitt Museum of today. This is on 5th Avenue and I think it's about 91st Street. You can see those top windows in the top floor. Those all have been given over to the many servants that the family had. Next slide. But this is a layout on that top floor. The corner room is for a housekeeper. There's female servant rooms on this side. There's male servant rooms on the bottom. Most of the servants seem to have their own room, but some of them are doubled up and sharing. And they actually have a maid's hall.
so that the entire floor was given up to the servants, and they would have gotten around the house by a back staircase where they could do the necessary work, but not really intrude too much with the family living there. This is in the Frick Mansion, another mansion where the top floor was given over to all the servants. It's a museum now, of course, the Frick Museum. And these are some actual buttons that I found just sort of scouting around. You can see the top one is for the maid, and the bottom one is for the butler. And when Mr. and Mrs. Frick needed their assistance, they would just press a button and their servant would appear. Okay, we'll talk about this servant's room in a moment. But I want to talk about something else first to give you just an idea of, it wasn't just like, the servants and the people that they worked for got along, as you can imagine. There was a lot of tension between servants and the mistresses that hired them. It was always the woman's job at the family in the Gilded Age to sort of hire, fire, manage the servants. And if you have many servants, that was a very all-consuming position. And it gave rise to this thing that was called the servant question, and often the servant girl question, because most of the problems were with the female servants, as there were many more of them because they all took the positions of maids and a lot of kitchen help and governesses and nursemaids. So the servant question was something that was endlessly debated in the upper class women. It was covered in newspapers all the time, periodicals. You can just imagine like a group of women at a luncheon, one of the topics of conversation would be the servant question, or at a tea party. And what the servant question really boiled down to is, why is it so hard to keep good help? That sounds very kind of uppity to us, and it really was. These were people who thought of themselves as kind of like American aristocracy. Their North Star was England, and they wondered why in England the servant class, did their jobs and were largely obedient, whereas in America, it just wasn't quite that way. Of course, the reason is because in England, which is a much more class-based society, they had people who were servants, they were born into the service, their grandparents were servants, their parents, and likely their children would be servants, and the families that employed them had a lot better a history of managing that servant class. In America, of course, where everybody had the opportunity to become their own millionaires, or so that was the promise at least, we didn't have that quite as rigid a class-based system. Most of the people who ended up as servants took the jobs as a stepping stone. They didn't cross the Atlantic with the idea that they were going to be doing laundry for the rest of their lives and that their children would be doing this as well. There's an article from 1895 in the New York Times that encapsulated what a lot of these upper-class women were thinking. And I wanted to read some of the passages from what some of the women told the reporter, so you can get an idea of the lifestyle of the maid and what the mistress of the house, what her issues were. This is from a woman, Mrs. Lester Carr. Her husband was a wealthy doctor. And she writes, "I never allow my servants an afternoon off during the week. Why should I lose so much time and put myself to a great deal of inconvenience in doing the work myself? I allow Sunday afternoons off because I believe in that. Also, when the servants' work is finished at night, I am perfectly willing that they should go out as they please. Only one servant must always be at home. I don't ask where they are going, and they may stay out until the house is closed at 11 o'clock. That is late enough, and after that, they can't come in." She also goes on to say, "I never take a servant if I can help it who has not been in service in the old country. They do not know that they are servants unless they have been. That is one thing they should know. It does not make any difference what they are. They may be ladies, but when they take a position, they are hired for service, and that is what they must be. The Irish Americans do not realize this, neither do the German Americans. An Irish servant, I think, is the best. I know the Swedes are considered to be, but they have no heart." So it sounds like Mrs. Carr has no heart, but this would be something that we wouldn't talk in polite society, grouping people by ethnicity, but in the Gilded Age, they did him properly. Now, this is another one of the ladies that was in the article. Her name is Mrs. Robert MacArthur. Her husband was the wealthy pastor of a very upper-class church. She takes a bit of a softer tone and she says, I could not say that I have had no trouble with servants, but very little. I have not even heard much complaint about servants from my friends. There are rumors of people having intemperate servants and being obliged to call in a policeman and all that, but I have never known of such a thing. I always try to be kind to my servants, and while I should discountenance any undue familiarity, I'd like them to feel that they are members of the family. I have never had them take advantage of my kindness. I try to raise a servant into a higher sphere of thought. And she continues, I think if people would treat servants less like animals or a part of their household furniture, they would get along better with them. I know many people who say, keep servants down as much as you can and you will get more out of them. No, I have not been troubled with incapable servants. I do not, of course, require a professional cook. I require a good plain cook, and the food must be prepared in a palatable manner. There are some servants whom I could not keep, and I may have had to try several times before I'd find one who suits me, but I never failed to do that eventually. I have sometimes wondered if I was easier than other people with my servants, that they and I have so little trouble. I have servants who have been with me for 7 and 8 years. If mistresses were kinder and more thoughtful, I think there would not be so much trouble as there is. So that can give you an idea of what the servants' duties were like, their time in the home, and why there was so much tension between the servants and the mistresses that employed them. The interesting thing about that article is a few weeks after it ran, an actual servant wrote into the New York Times with her side of the story, and they printed her letter. This is titled, What an Irish Girl Thinks. So much has been said lately through your paper on the servant question that I venture to ask you to be kind enough to listen to a servant's view of the case. That our faults have been told and retold is certainly a fact. Some of those faults I am willing to admit, others I deny. And so, as to what nationality makes the best servants, I hold that there are good and bad servants of every nationality. And I also hold that there are good and bad mistresses. Good, kind, conscientious mistresses whose every word and action command respect from their servants, and who never had and never will have any trouble get good servants. But there is another class who look upon their servants as a lot of inferior beings, put into this world with the sole purpose of drudging for them from morning till night, and who are afraid that if they treat their servants with anything like respect, their servants, it will lower them one step on the social ladder, which they found so very difficult to climb. If such people would only remember that we are human beings, flesh and blood, just as they are, but lacking all their advantages, which do go a great way to help people overcome their faults, then they would have better servants. But it seems to be an understood thing that the servant must be kept down. Tradesmen, laborers, in fact, everybody who works for a living, look forward to the end of their day's work. But the New York servant, no. She can sit inside her prison bars and dare not go out and get a breath of God's fresh air, which might help her temper and so benefit her mistress for the next day's work. I call that a mild form of slavery. So it's a pretty blistering letter. And I've often wondered, a little bit of, well, I wish that I had some biography about that servant and, what became of her. But all we know is that she was Irish, and it sounds like she was pretty young. And, I hope she found better circumstances. So the Gilded Age was a time when servants were in great demand, and there were plenty of people to fill those positions. But New York City has always had a long history of having servants. Going back into the colonial era, servants were largely African-American, enslaved and free men and women. Slavery was phased out in Manhattan in the 1790s, and the practice was outlawed altogether in the state by 1827. African-Americans still filled those servant jobs, but they were then joined in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s by that first great wave of immigrants, of Paramus and Irish people. Germans joined the service, of course, but not as great numbers as the Irish did. And it became something of a stereotype to have your Irish servant, typically a maid. these Irish servant girls, and I mean girls literally because many of them were maybe 15, 16, 17 years old, were really put down and ridiculed. They were considered unsophisticated when in fact they were simply country girls from the Irish countryside who had never really been to school. It had nothing to do with their own native intelligence, but they were thought of as, intellectually inferior. And they were Catholic. And although there were Irish people in New York City at that time, most of them were Protestant. And this great wave of Catholic immigrants almost sort of freaked out a lot of people in New York City. They had rosary beads. They said, prayers that were unfamiliar to them. They were sort of considered weird, not very bright. They actually wouldn't even use their servant's real name. They would sometimes just call her Bridget or Nora or Diddy. Later on, after the Civil War, and there were more groups that came to New York City to work as servants, they still derided everyone. The Scandinavians were considered not very bright. Some nationalities were considered lazier than others. You heard Mrs. Carr talk about how she didn't like the Irish Americans, meaning somebody who might have been the daughter or son of an Irish immigrant. She preferred the Irish. They were fresh off the boat, so to speak. Probably just didn't really know what kind of rights they had and were probably in a more desperate situation and took lower wages. Oh, no. But there were some benefits to being a servant. At the time, there were very few jobs open to women. That changed as the Gilded Age went on. You could become a shop girl. You could be a clerk in an office, perhaps, work in a factory. You could go into the needle trades, which a lot of Italian and Jewish women did. But by and large, being a servant was one of the few jobs open to you. And that had its benefits. Unlike the shop girl or somebody working in a factory who had to find a place to live, be able to pay rent, buy their own food, purchase the coal for heat and oil for cooking, and then pay the streetcar fare every time they needed to get to and from their job. A servant's room and board were taken care of. They generally lived in the house of the mistress who employed them. They didn't have to worry about that. They didn't have to worry about clothing. They were given a servant's uniform. If you've ever seen like a movie or an image of the servant, let's stay there. They didn't have to worry about buying clothes. They had the uniform. You've probably seen images of the maid with her sort of like a head, like a cap on her head, and the apron tied around her waist, and her linens and her dress is very much a servant's uniform, so to speak. You didn't have to worry about furnishings either. This scene here, this is from the top floor of the Merchant's House Museum. I don't know if anyone's ever been to the Merchant's House Museum. This is on East 4th Street in New York City. And it's a real wonderful time capsule. It's very furnished exactly as this wealthy merchant family would have had their furnishings. And on the top floor, they show you what the maid's room looked like. These are 2 beds. So there were 2 maids sleeping up here in this room. They're very plain, but, it looks fairly comfortable. They have a stove for heat. There's a desk there where they could perhaps write letters back to their families and send the money, some of the money that they were making. And unlike the rest of the family, which was in a row house that really only had the light coming in the front windows that was viewed by the street, they actually had these dormer windows, which gave them more light during the day. So there's one advantage there, is a little bit more light. But their lives were very tough. This is on the 4th floor of the house. There were no elevators at the time, but later in the Gilded Age, some of the houses did have elevators. Their jobs were to go up and down all of those flights of stairs, carrying coal, cleaning up the ashes and carrying them back down, bringing water up the stairs, carrying water that wasn't fresh anymore downstairs, doing tasks for the mistress of the home and the rest of the family members. It was a lot of backbreaking work. I'm sure that those beds were put into great use because when they finished their day at, say, 9 or 10 o'clock at night, they must have been bone tired. Very backbreaking work. But if it was the only thing offered to you, then it was one of the things that you just had to sort of suck up, as we would say today. And the idea was that your descendants wouldn't have to work as hard. They would have a ladder up in America and perhaps go on to a different kind of field. But one of the great things that a lot of the Irish servants and servants of other nationalities talk about is the deep loneliness that they felt. You're living in somebody's house, you're working for the family, you're familiar with the family, but you aren't the family. I have some excerpts to read from some of those women that lived in the houses. And again, they were usually women, although they were male servants. We'll talk about in a moment. This one writes, "What I minded was the awful lonesomeness. I went for general housework because I knew all about it, and there were only 3 in the family. I never minded being alone evenings in my own room, for I'm always reading or something, and I don't go out hardly at all. But then I always know I can, and then there is somebody to talk to through my mic. But there, except to give orders, they had nothing to do with me. It got to feel sort of crushing at last. I cried myself sick, and at last I gave it up, though I don't mind the work at all. I know there are good places, but the 2 I tried happened to be about alike, and I shan't try again." Another girl writes, "Ladies wonder how their girls can complain of loneliness in a house full of people, but oh, it is the worst kind of loneliness. Their share is but the work of the house. They do not share in the pleasures and delights of a home. One must remember that there is a difference between a house, a place of shelter, and a home, a place where all your affections are centered. Real love exists between my employer and myself, yet at times I grow almost desperate from the sense of being cut off from those pleasures to which I had always been accustomed. I belong to the same church as my employer, yet have no share in the social life of the church." She brings up the church, and that was one center of social life for a lot of the servants, especially the female servants. Their local Catholic parish would host them maybe one night a week. They could meet other servants. They could become friends with other servants. They could meet their servants, maybe an extended family, maybe a brother who might end up being a love interest. So the churches really did function as a social center for a lot of the servants, especially considering how cut off they were in their own house from the sort of the social life of the city that native-born American family girls were enjoying. It wasn't always so bad, the social life. It wasn't always that loneliness. I want to read to you from the story of a German nurse girl, as she describes herself. This is in a really remarkable book called The Lives of Ordinary Americans. It was published in 1906. This is a girl who came over when she was about 18 years old, and she immediately fell into a very wealthy family where she took care of the children. And she found a social life among the other servants in the house, as they employed a great many people. This is her story. "I had 3 children to attend to, one 4, one 6, and one 7 years of age. The one who was 6 years of age was a boy. The other 2 were girls. I had to look after them, to play with them, to take them about and amuse them, and to teach them German, which was easy to me because I knew so little English. They were the children of a German brother who talked to them in their own language, so they always knew something on it. I got along with these children very well and stayed with them for 2 years, teaching them what I knew and going out to a picnic or a ball or something of that sort once a week, for I'm very fond of dancing." And that would be with her friends that she made, other servants most likely. She talks about spending the summers with this family at their cottage in Newport. And of course, Newport was a playground of the ultra-rich in the Gilded Age, and cottage was the term they used for their great, fabulous mansions, which I'm sure you've all heard about, the Breakers, the Vanderbilts, or some of the other ones. Your heart did cottages to us. She stayed with that family for a couple of years, and she talks about the next family she went to. It was a very old man and his son and granddaughter who was married and had 2 children. They had a house up on Riverside Drive, and the old man was very rich. The house was splendid, and they had 5 carriages and 10 horses and a pair of Shetland ponies for the children. There were 12 servants, and I dined with the housekeeper and butler, of course, because we had to draw the line. By that, just saying hierarchy in the house, they were the top echelon. I got $25 a month here and 2 afternoons a week off. And if I wanted to go any place in particular, they let me off for it. She talks about the food that she was served as a servant. Wherever I have been employed here, the food has always been excellent. In fact, precisely the same as that furnished to the employers' families. In Germany, it is not so. Servants are all put on an allowance, and their food is very different from that given to their vassals. And this is where she talks about her social life. Unlike this country, I have a great many friends in New York, and I enjoy my outings with them. We go to South Beach or North Beach or Glen Island or Rockaway or Coney Island. If we go on a boat, we dance all the way there and all the way back, and we dance nearly all the time we are there. I like Coney Island best of all. It is a wonderful and beautiful place. I took a German friend, a girl who had just come out, down there last week. And when we had been on the razzle-dazzle, the shoot and the loop, and down in the coal mine and all over the Bowery, and up in the tower and everywhere else, I asked her how she liked it. And she said, "It is just like what I see when I dream of heaven." I always thought was a lovely quote. Just imagine these German servant girls and, their entry to America because of the families that they found to employ them was something wonderful. They probably went on to be successful in America. So how do people get servant jobs? You want to flip to the next slide? This is a group of women. These would be would-be servants. They're crowded at the office of the New York Herald. They would put an ad in the New York Herald or another newspaper, and the ad would say something along the lines of situation wanted, and they would list their skills. If they had been a housekeeper before, a laundress perhaps, a gardener, a coachman. Generally speaking, they wouldn't have to wait long to find a family to answer the ad and take them in for employment. Next slide. There were also servant agencies. This is a street in the Gilded Age here. You can see the servant sign. These agents worked in the office, so a new servant who maybe just came in from Castle Garden or Ellis Island could just come in there and see what was available. But a lot of the servants' agents actually went to Castle Garden and Ellis Island just to find girls and men who had just come over and had no place to stay, were desperately poor, wouldn't necessarily find the right boarding house for themselves. That's where people would stay who were unmarried. There were lots of boarding houses all over New York City, some safe and upper class or, at least decent. Others really were sort of unsavory, and you could fall into a bad situation there. They would go and they would look and they would see who was looking to leave. They had been processed and who they could maybe talk into coming with them to work in an employer's house and take them right there. It sounds almost kind of scary. They're just sort of poaching people, especially these young girls. But if you had no other options, we didn't know this city, you may not have spoken the language. It could be a good thing, especially if the fit between the mistress and the servant worked out well. Next slide. Here's another image of servants, all at a servant's agency. And what's interesting to me is a lot of these servants have children. They bring their children with them as there's no child care and perhaps even no husband to watch the children while the women went for work. If they were able to live in a servant's house, it would have been rare, though, for the servants, the mistress or the family, to allow a young child that young to live there. But if the child was old enough to do tasks and to help out, they might acquiesce. And it would be maybe a mother-daughter or mother and a son. Next slide. So let's talk about the hierarchy of the servants and who these people actually were that were living in the house. There's a wonderful book that was published in about 1902. It was called The Domestic Economy in the Millionaire Society. And it detailed all of the different servant positions that you would find in one of the great wealthy families. Not the kind of people that you would find in, say, the top floor of a brownstone or a townhouse, but sort of the mansion that I showed you earlier in your program, those people that would have 10, 15, maybe 20 servants living with them. The first one would be the highest person in the hierarchy would be somebody called the superintending housekeeper. And the superintending housekeeper, who is always a woman, would be sort of like the manager of the house, almost like the CEO of the household managing the other maids. Even though the mistress, it would be her responsibility to manage the maids. If she was wealthy enough, she could hire another woman who she trusted to actually do all of that work. It was a servant's position, but it paid well. And this servant, a superintending housekeeper, would have her own suite of rooms rather than just a room in the basement or upstairs. So what did the superintending housekeeper do? Well, as soon as she got up in the morning, she would check with the chef or the cook to find out what was on the day's menus. She would possibly give the chef a little bit of money if he needed to go to the market and buy things fresh, which probably would be what he would do every day, as there's no refrigeration and not a lot of heat for your food. She would inspect what the maids were doing, make sure that they were working properly. This is a ladies' maid, which we'll talk about in a moment, but you can see the sort of uniform that they all tended to wear was a little bit different. Some of the later slides I'll show you that somebody might have a white shirt on rather than black. And then it let people in the household know, exactly what level they were, because the servants were always coming and going. She would inspect what they were doing. It was her job to find out if there was an afternoon tea or a dinner party that night. If there was, it would be her job to contact the florist, make sure the right flowers would be coming. The candy dishes had to be perfect. And it would be her job to assemble the footstools under the table where proper guests who were female would rest their feet while they had dinner. Kind of a little unseen detail. That was very important if you were going to have a dinner party and people were going to feel at home. She would sometimes consult with the butler, who we'll talk about in a moment. She was able to dispense petty cash if another servant needed to purchase something. She would let in tradesmen if there was a problem with the plumbing or a wood carver was coming or some other kind of a tradesperson. She would handle that. In June, it would be her job to close up the house for the summer as the family would be going to their cottage in Newport or perhaps an estate in Long Island or in New Jersey. And it would be her job to open up the house again in September or October when they returned and the social season began. She also had the wonderful task of making sure that there were no croton bugs in the house. What was a croton bug? It's a very polite term for roaches. So if roaches are still with us in New York City, and they were rampant in the Gilded Age. You don't see them if you watch the HBO show about the Gilded Age, but they called them croton bugs because they thought that they came from the upstate water, the croton water, which they did not. Next up on the list would be the lady's maid. There's a great quote from the book I want to read to you about what it was like to be a lady's maid. This was probably the worst job that a servant would possibly have to take. The quote goes, "To be always, so to speak, attached to one end of an electric wire in readiness to respond to a call would not tempt one unless known the joy of independent movement. Probably there is no other position of service where one individual has more power to make another miserable." Her job would be to follow her mistress around essentially all day. In the morning, she would lay out her clothes for the morning, and people in the Gilded Age changed outfits 4 or 5 times a day. So every few hours, she would lay out a new outfit. She would get her fresh water ready, her beauty products. She would put out her blotter and her pen, because lots of wealthy women in the Gilded Age are cool by writing notes, which a footman would then deliver to a friend, and then they would get a return note. There's a little bit before telephones were, in everybody's house. She would go with her mistress to have dress fittings. She would travel with her. She was essentially there to attend to any kind of minor task that the mistress needed in the moment. I would imagine if it were me, I would find it extremely annoying to have somebody following me around all day. I would want a little bit of privacy, but apparently not for very wealthy women who employed ladies' maids. There's actually one famous lady's maid in history If you know the story of the Titanic, and you probably know that Ida and Isidore Strauss, Strauss was the co-owner of Macy's, was on the Titanic, and both refused to go into a lifeboat, and they died in the Titanic. But Mrs. Strauss's lady's maid was traveling with her, and they implored the lady's maid to get into one of the lifeboats. And one of the last gestures is that Mrs. Strauss draped her fur coat over her lady's maid, so she would be warm in the lifeboat. And her lady's maid survived the trip and was saved. Yes, a very miserable kind of position. And it didn't pay very much. It would be about $25 to $40 a month. This is, and to put in context, this is a time when the average working person wasn't making much more than about $300 a year. The next up would be the chambermaid. See, we have, there's our chambermaid. So she has a slightly different outfit. This was a very physical job. If you can imagine how heavy the bed linens were, the chambers were the bedrooms, and all the different blankets that people had on their beds and the heaviness of the drapes. It would be her job to actually, air all those out and kind of hold them up and, sort of do that kind of waving motion and, make sure that they were straightened out so that she could make the bed. Very physical labor. It was also her job to go around with a broom and cheesecloth and dust everything. And the chambermaid had the job of inspecting everybody's luggage. If it was a house guest who was coming in to stay with the family, or a member of the house who was back from a trip, she was inspecting them for something they called the scarlet runner, which would be bed bugs. You definitely didn't want to have a bed bug infection in the Gilded Age in your house. Flip the next slide. So there's our lady's maid and a chambermaid again. See the next slide. Our butler, we'll talk about him in a moment. Lower on the maid level would be the parlor maid. She would take care of all the downstairs rooms. She would open the curtains or the shades in the morning unless the family wanted them down, which a lot of families did. Gilded Age interiors, if you've ever seen pictures, are very dark and it's not a lot of light. It seems to be something people preferred. She would take care of tableware. She would put out any kind of food that was being served to guests. She would make sure that the linens were properly brought to the laundry. And she too would have her cheesecloth and a broom and just do a lot of sweeping and dusting. There's also a dining hall maid. The dining hall maid was probably the only servant to actually serve the servants. She served the breakfast, lunch, and dinners in the servants' dining hall, which many houses had. She essentially did everything but cook the food. She cleaned up. She put out the flatware. She put out the anything that would be eaten for the different meals. And servants in the era generally ate well, as the German nursemaid pointed out. They essentially got what the family would be eating that day, although they didn't give them certain vegetables and fruits, which were very costly and hard to come by. But they did get ice cream. That was one thing in the book that they mentioned, that dessert of ice cream was pretty common. So now here's our butler for the male side of the staff. So the book says, in every household with any pretension to fashion, the butler looms up an imposing figure. The butler was the head of the servant staff, sort of an equal responsibilities to the superintending housekeeper. It was his job to greet guests who came to the house, make sure that people were seated. He would take care of flatware and silverware. If you've ever been to a house where they have a butler's pantry, then you know that that would be where you would be storing silverware and other utensils that people ate with. He also had to have that countenance of an unflappability. I always thought that was a stereotype because of Lurch from the Addams Family, but that's actually how a butler had to be: very unemotional, be able to take any kind of responsibility. Often he had under butlers and somebody called the useful man that would do some of the harder work for him. The useful man is an interesting term. This was a guy who, because he was a man, would be tasked with things that were harder to do physically. A big block of ice was delivered for a party. It was his job to crack it into the small pieces that could be fit into a glass. He swept away the ashes and disposed of them for the maidens. He did anything that required any kind of physical strength. And he also helped the butler greet people at parties. So he had to be, on one hand, very physical, but on the other hand, be able to handle the guests and be very, receive very well. The next one. So here's our coachman. The coachman, of course, was the driver of the coach. By about 1910, automobiles came on the scene and were much more popular. Before that, you really needed somebody with a lot of physical strength who could drive a team of horses. You've ever seen images of the horsemen? It's really a very physical task, and it really took a lot of strength. I don't know if it took a lot of skill necessarily, or something that you could learn on the job, but the coachman would also be the overseer of the grooms who would live in the family's carriage house and were taking care of the horses. Next slide. There was another department, too, that's something that we don't think about as a servant's job because we all have washing machines and dryers, but doing the laundry. There could be a 4-person laundry department for a family. The laundry would have been on the top floor, even the roof, where there was a lot of ventilation and sunlight. There would be big vats of boiling water that the clothes would be deposited into. Somebody would have to wring it out and hang it up to dry. And it was very physical, backbreaking work. But this was all work that generally women took on. And sometimes they would have an under butler or the useful men doing the wringing out. You can never imagine the heavy materials of this Gilded Age clothes. You can imagine that it took a lot to wring it dry. So why don't we live this way anymore? Why don't we have a servant class like they did in the Gilded Age? Of course, we still do have servants. It's perfectly common to have a housekeeper come once a week or twice a month, and people have nannies and babysitters and dog walkers. It's a kind of servant in a way. But we don't employ these great armies of people living in our house, and there's lots of reasons for that. For starters, immigration by the early 1900s had really slowed to a halt. In 1920, laws were passed that made it so that very few Europeans could immigrate to America. This source of easy labor dried up, and it made it so that the people who were already working in America as servants or in another job really had the upper hand when it came to wages and conditions that they would agree to do. And a lot of wealthy people didn't really like that. The other thing had to do with this move into apartments. When apartments first hit the scene in New York City in the 1880s and 1890s, it was kind of an alien thing. This is the Dakota here. You can see the Dakota, this is in 1884 on Central Park West, still to this day. It's a beautiful building, and we would all probably love to have this apartment like the Dakota. But at the time, they were sort of seen as kind of strange. The whole idea was that you wanted to have your own house, whether that be a townhouse that was attached in a row or a single-family standalone mansion. Mrs. Astor reportedly sort of snubbed her nose at apartment living and called it living on a shelf. It was just not considered to be, it's considered to be very déclassé, almost like living in a tenement where you would have lots of different families under one roof. But that slowly changed. First of all, the apartment owners became very canny. They started advertising all kinds of services. These top floors here with the small windows, those were all servants' rooms in the Dakota. If you've ever seen the Plaza Hotel, they have the same kind of small little porthole type windows in their top floors. And these were because these apartment buildings were offering their own servants for the benefit of tenants who moved in. And then when they relieved the mistresses and the people that wanted servants of having to manage them and find them and fire them and hire them. If you lived in a building that did that all for you, that was a huge part of your day. You didn't have to worry. By about 1920, everybody was living in apartments. So it was sort of a slow transition. And the servants for the upkeep of the massive house, like the Rices or the Schwabs, those houses were all being bulldozed and going out of fashion. The other thing, too, of course, is that there were mechanical changes in appliances, electricity, that made tasks a lot easier. You no longer had to have 3 maids with cheesecloth sort of dusting different rooms of your house. You could have 1 maid who was in charge of vacuuming them all, and the vacuum is probably better and quicker. You didn't have to have this entire laundry department, because you would have a washer and dryer in your house, and you would have a maid who would handle that. And one person could handle doing loads of laundry, even the folding of it. It wasn't that difficult. Is there the next bit? Yes, this is another building. I think this is on the Upper West Side. And you can see those top floors. They're all apartments now, but early on they were the maids' rooms. So I've often wondered, why is there no memorial to servants? There's memorials to all kinds of positions in New York City. There's firefighters, policemen. There's memorials to the women who worked in sweatshops and the needle trades in the first part of the 20th century. But there's no servant memorial that's official. And I started to realize that there's actually an unofficial servants memorial, and that would be St. Patrick's Cathedral. This is St. Patrick's when it was completed in 1879. The idea for St. Patrick's was born in 1859. It took 20 years to build. And the Archdiocese at the time appealed to wealthy Catholic families to help fund it, to provide donations, which they did. But an enormous proportion of the donations they got were in the form of $2 or, $5 or $7. And these came from many Irish servants working in the great houses of Fifth Avenue. It was very important to them to contribute something to the building of a church that reminded them of their religion or even their homeland. And they actually donated some of their meager wages to do this. So next time you're on Fifth Avenue and you see St. Patrick's, just consider the facade and think of that each granite block sort of represents one of the servants who gave some of her wages to help build it. Or the beautiful exterior with the carvings represents another servant. These were all, the St. Patrick's was able to be completed with such loveliness with the help of their donations. And these are servants who, their descendants are probably, if not ourselves, if we look on our family tree, well, I'm sure we'll see servants. But the people that we live among today, their forefathers were probably, at least a few of them, were servants as well. So thank you very much.